You know, we completely take the concept of quitting for granted in our daily lives. Like, you hate your gym, you just cancel the membership.
Right. Or you hate your job, you pack up your desk and put in your 2 weeks notice.
Yeah, exactly. If
Yeah.
things get bad enough, you can just walk away.
Mm.
And we tend to think of freedom in these really grand political terms. You know, the right to vote, the right to free speech, freedom of assembly.
But what if the absolute irreducible metric of a free society is actually much simpler than that?
What if freedom is literally just the ability to walk out the door?
Because it is a binary condition, really. You can either leave or you are held captive. I mean, any system that removes your ability to exit isn't just flawed, it fundamentally owns you.
And that concept, the right to walk away, is the entire foundation of the incredibly provocative text we are exploring for you today. We're doing a deep dive into a 2026 policy proposal by Joseph Bay titled The Only Logical Asylum Policy.
It's a fascinating read. It's a rigorous, deeply controversial examination of Western asylum systems, the nature of a free society, and, well, a very stark view of mainstream Islamic doctrine. And to understand the sheer scale of the policy shift he's demanding, we really have to start with his foundational premise. Bay argues that our modern obsession with democracy as the ultimate marker of freedom is a mistake.
Yeah, this stood out to me immediately. He argues that direct democracy can easily just become the tyranny of the majority. He writes that a king who throws you in a dungeon at least admits he's an authoritarian. But if 51% of your neighbors vote to strip away your rights, they congratulate themselves on their virtue. They wrap their tyranny in, the moral authority of the people.
Which is why he shifts the metric entirely away from voting and toward this concept of the right to exit. And to illustrate this, he brings in a striking comparison from his own corporate background working at Samsung.
Oh, this analogy is wild.
It really is. He draws these deeply uncomfortable structural parallels between the corporate culture of that mega corporation and the state structure of North Korea.
Let's really paint the picture of this analogy for everyone listening because it's so specific. He points out that both systems, Samsung and North Korea, are run by third-generation hereditary rulers.
Yes, and they both demand absolute, unquestioning, top-down obedience.
Right. Both cultivate environments where you're quietly encouraged to monitor and report on your peers in the name of organizational purity.
He even talks about the indoctrination camps, like the corporate retreats that feel like re-education seminars, and the framed portraits of the founder that literally have to be kept pristine.
It's intense. And he argues the resemblance isn't just metaphorical, it's an identical psychological architecture.
Yeah.
But then he drops the hammer.
Yeah, the one definitive difference between the megacorporation and the totalitarian regime. At Samsung, no matter how oppressive the culture might feel, you can hand in your resignation.
It's the difference between a terrible job and a hostage situation. If you can't walk out the door, any other right you have is just a temporary privilege granted by the warden.
Exactly. If you can leave, the regime or the corporation ultimately has to compete for your presence. It has to serve you, or at least keep you satisfied enough not to resign. If you cannot leave, they own you.
So, okay, if the right to exit guarantees all other freedoms, how does Bay connect this corporate resignation analogy to modern refugee and asylum policy?
Well, Bay argues that Western asylum, at its core, was invented specifically to honor this exact principle on a global scale. We created the concept of asylum to be the emergency exit for people whose own governments have bolted the doors shut from the inside.
Right, we're essentially processing the resignation letters of citizens fleeing totalitarian regimes.
Precisely. And if Bay is right that asylum is about honoring the ultimate right to leave, it raises a really terrifying question. Who is being most systematically denied this right today?
And this leads directly into his intense focus on ex-Muslims.
Yes. Bay asserts that mainstream Islam systematically strips its followers of the right to exit. And he is very careful to specify that he's not talking about radical modern offshoots like ISIS or Al-Qaeda.
Right, he's talking about mainstream historical Islamic jurisprudence, which, according to his text, commands death for apostates, meaning anyone who leaves the faith.
I have to admit, reading this, I was skeptical. I thought surely he must be cherry-picking fringe extremist clerics, but he really brings the receipts on this.
He does. He rigorously cites the four classical Sunni schools of jurisprudence. That's the Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi, and Hanbali schools, along with their Shia counterparts.
And these are the foundational pillars of Islamic law, right? Relied upon by clerics and courts worldwide.
Exactly. He notes that across all four Sunni schools, The absolute legal consensus is that a sane adult who renounces Islam must be put to death.
Hold on, let's break those schools down for a second. How exactly does this death penalty for leaving the religion practically operate in these legal frameworks? I mean, do they just execute someone the moment they express doubt?
Depends on the school, but the variation is actually minimal. For instance, the Hanafi and Maliki schools generally prescribe a grace period of about 3 days for the apostate to repent and return to the faith.
Okay, 3 days. And if they refuse?
If they refuse after 3 days, the execution is carried out. The Shafi'i school has similar mechanisms, but some strict Hanbali interpretations dispense with the grace period entirely, arguing the apostate should be killed immediately. And Bey grounds all of this in a highly authenticated hadith, the recorded sayings of Muhammad, which plainly states, "Whoever changes his religion, kill him."
He backs this up with some pretty alarming data on how widespread this belief still is today, doesn't he?
Yeah, he points to a landmark 2013 Pew Research Center survey. And this wasn't a poll of fringe militant groups. This was the general public in Muslim-majority nations.
And the numbers are staggering.
Right. It found massive support for the death penalty for leaving Islam. 88% of Egyptian Muslims supported it, 79% of Afghan Muslims, and 76% of Pakistani Muslims.
That's overwhelming. Furthermore, he notes that nearly half of the world's 49 Muslim-majority countries still have apostasy or severe blasphemy laws actively on the books today.
That data completely shifts the perspective. It shows he's treating this as a mainstream systemic issue. But he also argues this apostasy rule doesn't just exist in a vacuum. He ties it into a much broader theological worldview.
Right, about how Islam views the outside world. Bey explains that classical Islamic doctrine divides the world into a binary. Dar al-Islam, which translates to the House of Submission, where Islamic law rules.
And Dar al-Harb, the House of War, which is everywhere else.
Exactly. And according to his reading of the doctrine, there can be no permanent peace between these two houses. There can only be periodic truces until the House of War is fully brought into the House of Submission.
Okay, wait, let's break these mechanisms down because he uses a lot of specific terminology here that we really need to clarify for you. He mentions jihad, hijra, dawah, and al-taqiyya. What exactly do these look like in practice in a Western context, according to Bey?
Let's start with jihad. Most Westerners think of jihad strictly as kinetic warfare, terrorism or armed conflict. But Bey points out that classical doctrine includes multiple mechanisms for conquest.
Like migration.
Yes, one is hijra, which is migration. In this context, migration isn't just moving for a better job, right? It is viewed as a religious duty to establish a demographic beachhead in the House of War.
So migration itself functions as a tool for expansion.
Right.
What about the others?
Then you have dawah, which translates to proselytization. It's the active effort to convert the host population and assert Islamic values in the public square.
Right.
And crucially, he points to al-taqiyya, which is the doctrine of permissible deception. It allows believers to conceal their true intentions or dilute their beliefs when dealing with non-Muslims, specifically if it protects the faith or advances its goals.
So if we put ourselves in the shoes of someone born into this system who simply stops believing, like an atheist in Pakistan or an ex-Muslim in Egypt, Bey paints a truly horrifying reality.
It's incredibly bleak.
It's not just that they might face state execution. Their own family is religiously commanded to disown them. Their marriage is automatically annulled by the state. Their children are taken away to be raised by Muslims.
Their property is confiscated. They are illegally rendered dead before they're physically hunted.
Which is exactly why Bey concludes that the ex-Muslim from an Islamic country is the absolute textbook paradigm of what the Western asylum system was invented for.
Because they have paid in blood for the principle of freedom of conscience. They have been entirely stripped of their right to exit, and they're grasping for it across our borders.
Right. And if Bey is right that these apostates are the ultimate refugees, it creates a terrifying paradox when they finally reach those Western borders. And this brings us to what Bey calls the corollary.
The corollary. What happens when that ex-Muslim actually settles in a city like London or Paris?
This is the crux of his argument regarding Western domestic policy. Bey argues it is logically perverse, bordering on insane, to grant asylum to someone who is fleeing the oppression of Sharia law, only to allow Sharia infrastructures to freely metastasize in the very host country that granted them sanctuary.
It's like granting a political dissident asylum from a brutal dictatorship, bringing them to your town, but then allowing the dictator's secret police to set up a sanctioned neighborhood watch program on the dissident's new street.
That analogy captures the exact dynamic. Bay is criticizing. The ex-Muslim crosses continents, braves the ocean, escapes a literal death sentence, and arrives in the UK, only to find the exact same ideological infrastructure operating down the street in places like Bradford or Birmingham.
And he uses the United Kingdom as his primary case study to prove that this parallel infrastructure isn't just a theory, it's already functioning.
Yeah, he notes that Britain currently hosts an estimated 85 functioning Sharia councils. This is the highest concentration in any Western democracy.
These councils operate as parallel arbitration courts, overwhelmingly dealing with family law, marriage, and divorce.
Wait, how does a Sharia council handle a divorce compared to a British civil court? Like, why is this such a specific problem for Bay?
Because under classical Islamic law, men and women have vastly different rights to exit a marriage. A man can execute a divorce, known as talaq, simply by declaring it.
Just by saying it.
Just by saying it. A woman, however, must seek a khula. She has to petition the clerics, she often has to prove abuse to their satisfaction, and usually has to surrender her financial rights or return her dowry to secure her freedom.
So the system explicitly disadvantages women, denying them equal exit rights.
Exactly.
How can a Western Ministry of Justice defend a shadow court system that explicitly disadvantages women? What could possibly be their legal justification?
This is what Bay finds so suicidal about Western policy. The Council of Europe has explicitly stated that Sharia law is fundamentally incompatible with the European Convention on Human Rights.
Right.
Yet Bay highlights that as recently as 2025, a UK Ministry of Justice minister defended allowing these Sharia courts to operate, framing it as a matter of British values, multiculturalism, and religious tolerance.
Bay's response to that defense is absolutely brutal. He essentially says that tolerating an intolerant parallel system isn't tolerance, it's a slow-motion surrender.
Yeah, he doesn't mince words.
Which brings us to a specific historical event he cites that absolutely blew my mind. The 2026 UAE incident. When I read this in the sources, I literally had to stop and read it twice to make sure I understood the players involved.
It is a massive diplomatic signal that the West largely ignored. In January 2026, the United Arab Emirates, which is a conservative, Muslim-majority Gulf monarchy, quietly removed several prominent UK universities from their list of institutions eligible for state-funded scholarships.
A Muslim country blacklisting British universities. Why?
Because UAE officials concluded that British campuses were no longer safe for their own Emirati students. They went on the record with the Financial Times, stating flatly that they did not want their children radicalized in Britain by Muslim Brotherhood networks.
Wait, radicalized in Britain?
Yes. The UAE views the Muslim Brotherhood as a dangerous, destabilizing political Islamist organization. After years of lobbying London to ban the Brotherhood and being totally ignored by British politicians, the UAE simply pulled their students out.
Just think about the staggering irony there. A Gulf monarchy is treating British higher education the exact same way Britain might treat a radical foreign madrasa in Yemen. They are literally protecting their kids from British radicalization.
It's wild. And Bay uses this to argue that Western institutions, from university administrations to the Home Office itself, have been entirely captured.
Captured how?
He argues they are paralyzed by the fear of being labeled Islamophobic and captured by the electoral math of relying on Muslim voting blocs in marginal constituencies. They're allowing parallel infrastructures to grow because they lack the political courage to stop them.
Now, if you are listening to this right now, you might be thinking, okay, this diagnosis is harsh, but what could anyone realistically do about this? You can't just outlaw religion.
Right, that's the obvious pushback.
But Bay actually anticipates that exact reaction, and his proposed remedy is going to sound incredibly radical to a modern ear.
He really isn't interested in half measures. Bay proposes a systematic four-part remedy designed to completely dismantle this parallel infrastructure and reassert the absolute supremacy of secular law.
So if the problem starts with who we let in, I assume his first policy shift involves the border.
Yes. The first part of his remedy is establishing default, expedited asylum specifically for ex-Muslims fleeing Islamic countries. He argues they are the paradigm of what the 1951 Refugee Convention was designed to protect.
Okay, so if you can prove you are fleeing apostasy charges, the West's doors open for you.
Exactly.
That addresses the people fleeing the system. But what about the infrastructure that is already operating inside the West? The 85 Sharia councils in the UK.
That brings us to his most controversial proposal, a hard freeze and rollback. Bey calls for zero new Islamic infrastructure permitted in the West.
Zero.
Zero. He means no permits for new mosques, the immediate shuttering of all unregistered Sharia councils, and an end to all state recognition of Islamic marriages that aren't primarily civil contracts.
He goes after the daily cultural exemptions too, doesn't he?
He applies it across the board. No public halal exemptions for ritual slaughter, which bypass animal cruelty laws. No public funding or university recognition for any society tied to the Muslim Brotherhood. He wants to physically and legally halt the expansion of the religion in the public square.
So if he implements this hard freeze, what happens to the millions of practicing Muslims already living in the West who actively want to live under Sharia law?
Bey's answer to that is emigration. He notes there are more than 50 Islamic majority countries worldwide. If a citizen living in the West fundamentally believes that Islamic law is superior to secular law, the West should gladly allow them to exit.
So he just tells them to leave.
He proposes an open door, even offering financial relocation assistance for anyone who wants to move to a jurisdiction that already provides the Sharia system they desire.
And for those who choose to stay.
For those who remain, Bey demands an irrevocable, formal public acceptance that Western secular law is absolutely supreme over any religious law. This includes a formal societal acceptance that apostasy, the right to leave Islam, is a fundamental human right.
Right.
And that doctrines of jihad and dawah, when practiced as mechanisms to subvert the host society, are totally incompatible with Western citizenship.
I can hear the objections to this forming right now. I mean, it sounds entirely unfeasible. It violates modern norms of religious freedom. When has a Western democracy ever done something like this?
Bey is fully prepared for that objection. He points out that the West has actually done this exact thing multiple times in history. Free societies have always eventually forbidden state-within-a-state ideologies from taking root.
Give me an example of how that practically worked, because cracking down on a belief system sounds, well, impossible.
Look at how the United States federal government handled Mormon polygamy in the late 19th century. The early Mormon church viewed plural marriage as a divine command, superseding federal law.
So the government stepped in?
The U.S. government didn't just ask nicely for them to stop. They passed the Edmunds-Tucker Act of 1887. The state seized the financial assets of the Mormon Church, disenfranchised their voters, and jailed their leadership. They applied crushing, unrelenting state pressure until the church itself officially issued a manifesto abandoning the doctrine of polygamy.
So they didn't outlaw being Mormon. They forced the religion to adapt its doctrines to conform to the secular law of the land.
Exactly. Bey cites that, along with the English crackdown on Catholic recusancy in the 17th century when Catholics were viewed as potential agents of foreign powers, and the violent suppression of fascism in the 20th century.
So he views political Islam as the 21st century equivalent.
Yes, a comprehensive political and legal system masquerading purely as a personal faith.
He is presenting a terrifyingly stark choice here. He essentially argues that mainstream Islam and Western civilization are mutually exclusive operating systems. They make entirely conflicting claims on who gets to dictate the freedom of conscience, the authority of the courts, and the equality of women.
His ultimate conclusion is that the West faces an unavoidable binary choice. Either we recover the nerve to enforce our secular laws and crush parallel legal systems, or we experience a slow, ugly demographic transition where the freedom to leave is quietly abolished block by block, city by city.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We started by exploring Bey's defining metric of a free society, the right to exit, and why handing in your resignation at Samsung proves you aren't in North Korea.
And then we walk through the rigid, deadly theological laws surrounding apostasy across all 4 Sunni schools, establishing the ex-Muslim as the ultimate asylum seeker.
Right. And we unpacked his devastating critique of Western parallel infrastructures, from the UK's Sharia councils to the UAE pulling their students out of British universities, culminating in his radical demand to freeze and roll back Islamic infrastructure.
And while we have rigorously explored Bey's unvarnished views today without endorsing them, the underlying friction he points to simply cannot be ignored. Every modern democracy is currently struggling to figure out how to balance absolute religious freedom with the preservation of universal secular human rights.
It forces us to ask where the line is between multicultural tolerance and suicidal complicity.
It strips away the comforting buzzwords and demands an answer to a terrifying mechanical question, like, can a society actually survive if it extends its tolerance to parallel systems that fundamentally reject its foundational rules?
It's the ultimate test of a free society's immune system. And I think the essay leaves us with a profound warning about the nature of consensus. If the right to leave is the one freedom that guarantees all others, what happens to a free society if the polite consensus makes it forbidden to even ask if that freedom is disappearing? Where exactly is the line between a society being wonderfully tolerant and a society being culturally suicidal?
It really makes you think about that beautifully decorated door again. We can spend all our time arguing about the paint color, we can debate the hinges, and we can pat ourselves on the back for being so inclusive in our design choices. But if we aren't even allowed to check if the deadbolt has been locked from the outside, are we really free at all? Thank you for joining us on this incredibly complex deep dive. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep seeking those aha moments. We'll see you next time.